I never thought this would happen to me. Growing up, I always felt safe in my home. It wasn't a fancy house, just a small, cozy place my family had owned for generations. After my parents passed away, I moved back in to live alone, thinking the familiar walls would offer comfort. I was wrong. It started about 6 months after I moved back. At first, it was small things going missing, items I knew I had placed in certain spots, suddenly reappearing in odd places. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. I was adjusting to living alone again, and maybe I was just misplacing things. But then, the sounds started. Every night after I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I heard faint scratching noises coming from inside the walls. I told myself it was probably just mice or some small animal that had gotten in. It's an old house, after all. But the scratching became more frequent and louder, almost like it was right behind the drywall. I called an exterminator who came and found nothing. He told me the house was clear, no rodents, no signs of anything unusual. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Soon, it wasn't just scratching. I began hearing whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs, like someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. I would get up, turn on every light, and search the entire house, but there was never anyone there. Still, I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that maybe the isolation of living alone was playing tricks on me. Then, one night, everything changed. I had fallen asleep in the living room, TV on low, when I woke up to a soft creaking noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I saw it, movement in the corner of the room. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. Out of the shadows, something or someone moved slowly, almost deliberately. It was a figure, tall and thin, and it was walking straight toward me. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure moved silently, coming closer until it stood just a few feet from where I sat on the couch. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to even reach for my phone. The person, because now I could see that it was a person, stood there, staring at me through the dim light of the TV. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his clothes dirty and torn. He was thin, almost skeletal, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. And then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. His voice was raspy, almost like a hiss. I finally managed to move, grabbing my phone and backing away. I ran out of the house, locking myself in my car, and called the police. They arrived quickly, searching the entire house, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no hidden doors. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't until the next day that we found the truth. I hired a contractor to inspect the house, and what he discovered made my blood run cold. Behind one of the walls in the attic, there was a small crawl space, just big enough for someone to hide. Inside the crawl space were old, dirty blankets, food wrappers, and a collection of small items. Items that had gone missing from my house over the past few months. Someone had been living in my walls. The police were called again, and they told me something I never wanted to hear. They suspected the person had been squatting in the house for months, maybe even before I moved back in. They found a hidden entrance behind the drywall in one of the closets, leading to the crawl space. Whoever had been living there knew my every move. They had access to my home, my belongings, and my life, and I had no idea. But the worst part, they never caught him. After that night, he disappeared without a trace, leaving only the evidence of his time living in the shadows of my home. I couldn't stay there anymore. I sold the house and moved far away, but the terror of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I think I hear faint whispers or the sound of someone walking just beyond the walls. And every time I wonder if he's found me again. It all began in 2019 when I started working as a night shift manager at a small, rundown motel. Nothing fancy, but it was a job. Most nights were quiet, just the occasional late check-in, maybe a couple of guests asking for extra towels. The kind of job that's easy enough to handle. But there was something about room 304. From the first night, I felt like there was something wrong with it. It was at the end of a long, dim hallway on the 3rd floor. Nobody ever wanted to stay in room 304. Guests would book it, but as soon as they stepped inside, they'd ask for another room or even check out altogether. The complaints were always vague. "It just feels weird in there," or "I don't like the energy." One night, I was doing my rounds when I noticed that room 304 was occupied, despite no one checking in that day. I figured it was a system error and headed up to check. The hallway was darker than usual, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. When I reached the door, I heard a faint sound, a soft humming like a distant lullaby. My heart started racing. The door was slightly ajar, which was strange because the cleaning staff always locked up after servicing rooms. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the room looked untouched. Neat, perfectly made bed, curtains drawn. But that humming continued, echoing through the space, though I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. The temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, which didn't make sense because it was the middle of summer. Then the TV suddenly switched on by itself, static filling the screen. My heart nearly stopped. I rushed over to turn it off, but the second I did, I heard it, a whisper, right behind me. I spun around, and there, standing by the door, was a figure, a woman in a white dress. Her hair was long and tangled, covering her face. My body froze. She didn't move, just stood there, barely visible in the darkness of the room. I blinked, and she was gone, as if she had never been there. I sprinted out of that room, my breath heavy, and locked the door behind me. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself, but that wasn't the end. The next night, I was going through the security footage, reviewing the halls for any disturbances. When I got to the footage outside room 304, my blood ran cold. There, on the screen, was the same woman I'd seen. She was standing in the hallway, motionless, staring directly at the camera. I leaned in closer, watching as she faded into the wall and disappeared. The following week, I found out that a woman had died in that room, years ago, a suicide. Guests reported strange occurrences ever since, but management had brushed it off as just rumors to avoid any bad press. I quit the job shortly after. To this day, I avoid that place. But the worst part, I still see her sometimes. At night, when I'm alone, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of her, just standing there, watching me. I don't know if I'll ever escape her. It started out like any other night. I was visiting some friends in a small town about 2 hours from where I live. We had a great time, stayed up late, told ghost stories, laughed about how none of us really believed in that stuff. Well, at least I didn't before. The house they were renting was old, but in a cozy, creaky floorboards kind of way. One of those old Victorian homes that feels like it's alive. You know, the kind that has history. It was around 1 a.m. when everyone started heading to bed. My friends had gone upstairs, but since I was staying in the guest room downstairs, I lingered a little longer in the living room, scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from somewhere. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. But it didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, and that's when I felt that knot of unease start to tighten in my stomach. I decided to go check it out, thinking maybe it was just a branch against the window or some animal outside. But the closer I got to the back of the house, the louder the tapping became. I stood in the hallway staring at the back door, the sound echoing through the silent house. Tap, 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 and then I saw it. The door handle. It was slowly turning. My blood turned cold. I froze. Was someone trying to break in? I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the sound of my pulse in my ears. I slowly backed up, not taking my eyes off the door. And then, in an instant, the tapping stopped. The handle stopped moving. Silence. I stood there for a moment, listening, straining to hear anything. Was it over? Had someone just messed with the wrong house and left? I started to relax just a little when, bang! Something hit the door hard, shaking the frame like someone was throwing their whole body against it. This time I didn't freeze. I ran. I bolted upstairs, heart racing, and burst into my friend's room, barely able to get the words out. Someone's trying to get in. Of course, they thought I was overreacting. They told me it was probably just the wind or maybe a raccoon. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. They reluctantly came downstairs with me, their sleepy annoyance quickly turning into tension as soon as they saw the door. The handle was scratched up, and there were marks on the door like someone, or something, had tried to break it down. I could tell they were freaked out too, but none of us wanted to admit it. We all stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Just as we started to relax, thinking maybe it was just an animal, we heard something even worse, a voice. It came from the other side of the door, low, almost a whisper. "Let me in." I swear to you, I've never felt fear like that in my life. I couldn't move. None of us could. It was like something straight out of a nightmare. We stood there, glued to the spot, listening to this voice ask again and again, "Let me in." My friend Mark finally broke the silence. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound brave, but his voice cracked. There was no answer, just the sound of breathing, heavy, ragged breathing. And then, silence. We waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The voice stopped. The banging stopped. Everything was just quiet again. We didn't wait around. We packed up our stuff, piled into the car, and drove off into the night, adrenaline pumping. I didn't care if it was just someone messing with us or something worse. I wasn't staying another second in that house. It wasn't until we were halfway home that we realized we never heard footsteps. Nothing walking away. Just silence. We never figured out who or what was outside that night. My friends didn't talk about it after. They didn't want to. But I can't stop thinking about that voice. That cold, unnatural voice. "Let me in." In the summer of 2015, Sarah was living alone in a small, old apartment building. The place had a charm, but also a few quirks, including a vintage mirror she had inherited from the previous tenant. It was a large, ornate mirror with an intricate gold frame that hung in the hallway, facing the bathroom door. One night, after returning from a late shift at work, Sarah felt an odd chill in the apartment. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just her tired mind playing tricks. As she passed the mirror, she noticed a faint, dark shape in the reflection, almost like a shadow. The next night, the shadow was more pronounced, and Sarah could swear it resembled a woman's figure. She decided to investigate, but found nothing unusual in the apartment. The mirror was clean, and nothing else seemed out of place. A few days later, Sarah had a friend over, and they talked about the mirror. Her friend, Lisa, was intrigued and suggested they try an experiment. They would both stand in front of the mirror at midnight and see if anything happened. Skeptical but curious, Sarah agreed. At midnight, they stood in front of the mirror. Initially, nothing seemed unusual. But as the clock struck 12, Sarah felt a cold breeze, and the lights flickered. In the reflection, Lisa saw a dark figure standing behind them, a woman with long, disheveled hair and a pale face. Sarah, who hadn't seen the figure, felt a sudden, intense dread. They turned around, but no one was there. The figure was gone from the mirror, and the apartment felt oddly silent. They quickly ended the experiment and decided to leave the mirror alone. The next few nights, Sarah couldn't sleep. She would wake up at odd hours, feeling as though someone was watching her. The figure in the mirror seemed to grow clearer and more defined, always appearing just behind her when she looked in it. One night, after a particularly disturbing experience, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She covered the mirror with a blanket and tried to sleep. That night, she was plagued by vivid nightmares of the woman in the mirror, who would reach out to her from within the glass. The next morning, Sarah decided to get rid of the mirror. She called a friend to help her move it out of the apartment. As they carried it out, Sarah glanced at the mirror one last time and noticed a message scratched into the back. "Help me." After that, Sarah never experienced anything unusual again. She later learned from the landlord that the mirror had been part of a set once owned by a woman who had mysteriously disappeared years before.